Hi, my name is Kleiman. I'm the founder and executive director of Cures Within Reach for Cancer. I started Cures Within Reach for Cancer because of my mom's experience with cancer and because of my training as a computational biologist and cancer researcher. I'm currently the scientific research director of a computational biology center at Dana-Farber. When my mom was diagnosed with multiple myeloma, a blood cancer, I learned that one of the standard treatments, thalidomide, had actually first been developed as a treatment for morning sickness. Only 50 years later was it discovered to be useful for myeloma. Digging into the literature, I found that there are hundreds of existing drugs, some of which are already in your medicine cabinet, that could be effective as cancer treatments. However, these promising therapies are not being developed because there's a lack of commercial interest. This is because when drugs are off patent and inexpensive, pharmaceutical companies won't fund the clinical trials because they're unlikely to generate significant profit from selling the drug for the new indication. I started Cures Within Reach for Cancer to fill this gap in our drug development system. Our mission is to ensure that highly promising treatments currently being stalled due to a lack of commercial interest undergo clinical testing and are made available to cancer patients around the world. Our primary objectives are to identify the repurposed drugs and combination treatments with the strongest evidence of effectiveness for cancer, facilitate definitive clinical trials, and create sustainable funding models. Repurposing of drugs already FDA approved, especially when they have a long history of safe patient use, is an efficient way to develop new therapies, as shown in yellow here. Compared to new drugs, the time and cost of developing generics is significantly reduced. There's a greater chance of success in phase 3 trials, and drug costs are much lower. A manual review of the literature found 34 non-cancer generic drugs that have shown benefit for treating cancer patients in randomized clinical trials, some of these leading to more than a 1-year increase in survival compared to standard of care in late-stage disease. There's human data for 108 drugs. This includes observational studies and case reports. And these 235 drugs have all shown promise for treating cancer, either in clinical studies or preclinical studies. And this is just scratching the surface. The manual review may have missed some existing evidence, and new repurposing opportunities are continually being discovered. We're developing an oncology repurposing engine. First, we're using machine learning to systematically gather and analyze the data on repurposed drugs. This information comes from PubMed and clinicaltrials.gov, as well as real-world data. This information hub will be made freely available to researchers, clinicians, and the public to democratize insights. Next, we'll prioritize repurposing opportunities based on factors such as the likelihood of success and potential impact on patient care, and whether there are any known barriers to trial accrual or clinical adoption. For the most attractive candidates, we'll scope the clinical trials to determine whether additional preclinical data are needed, how trials will be funded and managed, and partners to execute the trials. Our success will be measured by repurposing data being synthesized and made publicly available, starting with the clinical evidence, repurposing opportunities ranked, trials assessed and initiated, and ultimately by repurposed therapies being incorporated into medical practice. In addition to the repurposing engine, one of our key priorities is to create new funding models and economic incentives to enable these trials. One approach leverages healthcare dollars that are saved when patients have better outcomes with these treatments. On the philanthropy side, I just made my first $10 million pitch, so I'll find out the results of that soon. This is an ambitious effort, and I'm grateful to have a phenomenal team in place. Our leadership team, volunteers, and advisors together have the relevant and diverse expertise to enable us to succeed with this effort. This is a picture of my mom, who passed away last year. She's a constant reminder for me that patients need more effective treatments now, and that we can't leave any stone unturned in this fight against cancer. We're currently raising startup funds for our initial projects, And please reach out to me if you're interested in getting involved or learning more to help us transform the treatment of cancer with these available, safe, and affordable therapies. Thank you.
Great job. I really have just a comment. It's not even a question for you. You have an incredibly effective, powerful message that you're conveying, and this goes out to all speakers that are here tonight. You really got to the Simon Sinek golden circle of why you're doing what you're doing. A lot of people don't do that effectively. I think you did a remarkable job. So great, and it's great to weave in a human element to what you're doing. So just a general comment. And the only other thing I would say is think about family offices, going to that philanthropic impact investor. I think that you'll find some money there.
I'm sorry, what do you mean by family offices? Do you mind?
Family offices they're looking more and more like institutional investors. They have, they're more of a philanthropic. They generally sit on a lot of money. It's a very wealthy family, high net worth or ultra high net worth person who has $250 million and they're wanting to put their money into causes, whether that's cardiovascular disease, what have you. I would encourage you to take a look at. I can certainly give you a number of family offices. Let's stop over when I'm done with her over meatballs, and we can.
Thank you.
Go ahead. So I guess I will ask a question and maybe step back a bit. So where has your funding come from, and what do you see as the makeup of funding, how it actually kind of slices and dices moving forward?
So we're just starting off. So for now, we've been raising funding through philanthropy, small amounts of funding so far. And how it will be made up. So kind of see two separate buckets of funding. One being work that we'll be doing in-house around this process of gathering the data, figuring out which trials are most promising to pursue, and kind of setting up those trials so they're ready to go. After that, there will be work that's done outside of our organization to do preclinical studies as well as the clinical trials. So that will be done with partners. For the initial work, we expect to spend the first few years really gathering all of this evidence. So I didn't mention it, but there are 10,000 publications on repurposing drugs for cancer. A huge amount of information that really most people don't know about. And so our first effort is to gather all of that and make people aware of it. I mean, even payers. We think payers will be an important partner in this process.
And just one more, what's your background other than loving daughter and dutiful legacy? What's your personal background?
I was in the first PhD program for systems biology in the world at MIT. So I graduated from that program where I did a combination of computational and experimental work studying cancer. And then I did my postdoctoral work at Mass General and Harvard Medical School, doing more translational work, so working with clinical trials and identifying new treatments for cancer. Actually, there was some early work there on repurposing, so we were looking for new drugs for pancreatic and colorectal cancers, including drugs that already existed. And so my training is mostly in systems biology and cancer research. And like I said, now I'm the scientific research director of the CBio Center at Dana-Farber, which is a computational biology and informatics group.
Thank you.
So great presentation. I have a couple of questions. One is, how are you going to identify the drugs? Is it just through looking through this evidence in the papers, or are there other ways for you to identify the drugs?
Okay, so first, for the scope of the drugs that we'll be looking at, those will be 1,500 drugs, which are the number of drugs that have been FDA approved and are now off patent. So we would start there. And like I was showing, around 250 of those have already shown some promise for cancer. So part of it will be through a directed approach. looking at where there's already evidence, either preclinical or clinical, of course, starting with where there's already, say, randomized phase 2 clinical trials showing efficacy and safety. After that, we do have a component where we would like to work on identifying new repurposing opportunities as well. There are other people working in that space. Academics are looking for new repurposing opportunities. So, for example, at the Broad Institute. And also pharmaceutical companies and biotech companies where they're mostly looking at repositioning. So drugs that are shelved haven't been approved yet, but where there's some early clinical evidence that they could be safe.
Yeah, I was going to ask about shelf drugs. So how do you find out about those?
So we aren't including that right now.
Okay.
So right now we only look at drugs that are FDA approved, and in particular when they're off patent, when they've been used for at least 20 years in people. We have a huge amount of safety information about these drugs. They're inexpensive, and so there are many reasons why we think that it's very important to focus on these generic drugs.
Yeah. And just one thought that I'm having is I wonder if you chose a specific disease area within cancer, if you're seeing anything more promising in certain disease areas that might be able to speak more specifically to some of the family offices. So if you were to identify breast cancer as something that was more promising, you might target family offices that were really investing behind breast cancer.
Yep. So the first clinical trial that I actually spent a year getting ready to go is a drug for breast cancer and lung cancer. It's to prevent recurrence of breast and lung cancer. It's used around the time of surgery to prevent recurrence. So there, it's the evidence that exists is very strong, and it's almost like low-hanging fruit. So that's one area we're working in. I do think that it's important to do this wide scope and carefully identify which are the most promising opportunities, both based on both the disease and the drug, so separately and then together. So for example, with diseases, we might look at how many people are affected by those diseases, where there's low survival rates, like lung cancer, for example. Right now, I would say that we don't have a focus. That's going to be determined once we go through this process. And it may also be slightly determined by the funder and their interests, because there are a lot of opportunities.
Once you have identified a drug, have you thought about what the business model is for getting that paid for?
Yep. I don't know if I have lots of backup slides, but I haven't used them yet. I'm debating about whether to pull it up.
Don't need to.
Maybe I'll mention a little bit about how we're thinking to leverage healthcare dollars to pay for clinical trials. That's one mechanism that we're thinking about to create sustainable funding models for those trials. So the idea is using something called a social impact bond, which is also known as a pay-for-success model. I do have a slide on it. Not sure if you want me to bring it up. But it's a way to, with those treatments that I was mentioning that are used around the time of surgery to prevent recurrence, there are many opportunities in that space. And when you don't have to treat recurrence, then you save the payers, whether they're insurance companies, governments, depends on where you are, save a lot of money in not having to treat those cancers that return. So it would be great if payers just understood that and funded the trials with the understanding that some of those treatments would lead to cost savings. Social impact bonds are a way to de-risk the process for payers. So impact investors would fund the clinical trials, probably a basket of trials, with the assumption that maybe 20% will lead to effective therapies. And then based on the cost savings that are realized, there's an upfront agreement that payers will pay back the cost of these trials. And this is obviously easier to set up in a single payer system. So we're starting out by piloting this in the UK with the National Health Service. But other countries, we're also talking with other countries to get involved as well.
Great, thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Great.